Welcome to Roots and Relevance. We are in the middle of a series called Stories of Revolution, going through the parables of Jesus. Just finished Luke 15, a three-parter on the Lost series. And we're going to actually just go to the next chapter today and talk about the parable of the Shrewd Manager, or some of you may have heard it called the Dishonest Manager.
Did I tell you that the very first time I ever preached, I preached on the Shrewd Manager?
That's an interesting choice for your first sermon ever, because it's like not the easiest.
I wasn't given a choice.
You were not given a choice. Got it. Well, it's funny. I initially had an article for you guys about the idea of like being shrewd and is that okay? And we'll talk about why I pivoted in a little bit, because I think this parable is way bigger than about shrewdness. It has a different main point. And it has to do with this idea of like money and how we relate to it. There's a guy, some of you may know him, a guy by the name of Shane Claiborne, out of Philadelphia, Christian. Sometimes like he can be controversial because of the way he lives and because of some of the things he says. And years ago, he posted something on one of his social media accounts, and I'm just going to read this because it got a lot of backlash. And I'm just curious, as you hear it for the first time, how you would respond to this. This is Shane Claiborne, and he says this: asking if it is okay for Christians to be rich is a strange question. It is like asking if it is okay for Christians to overeat or watch too much TV. It may be permissible, but that doesn't mean it's a good idea. I believe Jesus came to set us free, and one of the things he wants to set us free from is our obsession with money and possessions, which is why he says such harsh things like, woe to you who are rich, Luke 6:24. Why would we want to try and accumulate the stuff that Scripture says the love of which is the root of all sorts of evil? John Wesley said so well, if I have money in my hands, I get rid of it quickly, lest it make its way into my heart. A constant thread in Scripture is that we are not to take more than we need, while others have less than they need, a radical critique of the world we live in. The early Christians went so far as to say that if a Christian has more than they need, while their neighbor is in need, that Christian is a thief. If we have two coats, we have stolen one. Too much? Or is he right in line with the teaching of the gospel? Because I can tell you that like Christians probably had the most bold reaction to this.
I assume negative.
It was mixed, but yes, very negative. Why are you so down on the idea that wealth is a bad thing? Well, I think the response is, well, wealth is actually a neutral thing. It can be either used for good or it can be used for bad.
Is that what you're saying? Or is that what they were saying?
That's what they were saying.
Okay.
And Shane Claiborne is like, well, not really. Wealth is not something that's necessarily to be pursued, just like overeating or, anything else like that it may be permissible, but it's not what we're supposed to be about. Like as I say that, what comes up for you?
A little furrow between my eyes.
Talk to me. Is that just an emotion, or do you have like a critique about it?
Again, I struggle when people speak in the extremes. And this is really, it's an extreme perspective. Now, we can argue the gospel isn't an extreme perspective, but I can see what he's saying. I mean, the Israelites in the desert for 40 years received their daily bread. And the mandate is don't carry anything over, don't keep things. I'm going to provide for you all that you need. I am enough. You'll have what you need. And God, every day, 40 years, provided for what they needed. And it's echoed in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. There is this idea that provision comes from God, and so we don't need to worry about tomorrow. Matthew 6, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow has enough trouble of itself. To seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and the rest be added unto you. We don't need to worry about those details.
The word enough, I heard you say, I think is a pretty key word.
I agree.
Like having enough.
Well, that's Shabbat language. Thank you, Daniel Cox, for talking about.
Oh no, you lit the fuse.
Beautiful that you talked about Shabbat. Well, Claiborne uses the word need. That's a tough word too. What do we really need? I mean, very few things we need, and it depends on what you really want out of life. If death is at your door at any moment because you don't need medical services because you get sick or you break your arm. Do you really need a doctor? Do you really need pharmaceuticals? Do you really need it? So what's the need mean anyway? Well, a need's always a goal. Your goal, for you to achieve a goal, then there's needs for you to achieve a goal, right?
Right.
And if our goal is to just live without clothes in the middle of a jungle, then what do you really need? You don't really need anything. Maybe food, but if death is not the goal, or living is not the goal, then you really don't really need anything.
That's an interesting point.
Thank
this
you.
idea of food, because like one of the things that Shane Claiborne brings up is that the early church, when some of them were in need of food, like they couldn't eat, that the entire church fasted, because the idea was if one of us can't eat, then none of us are going to eat. And they would fast until food came on, which, to Daniel's point, that's extreme.
Well, what if they cut off their pinky? Do they all cut off their pinky? To share the pain?
Are you contradicting the logic of the Bible,
No.
Jonathan?
Is that the same thing if your friend jumped off the cliff, if you jumped off the cliff?
Well, if you're trying to support the community and have your head bashed against rocks and you're almost dead, I guess you could share in the suffering. But I'm not quite sure that's what the Bible preaches. And so, Daniel's talked about enough, and enough goes to need, and enough are tough things. I guess it depends on culture, but does it? I don't know. We don't need eyeglasses. Three of us are wearing eyeglasses today. Do we really need those? We have to see. I have contacts and glasses. Hey, Wally. No, I'm finished babbling. I think this is a very difficult thing because I think we have to put parameters.
I think it has to do with how you leverage what you have.
There's that word.
There's a word we talked about yesterday.
That's gonna come up more.
Right. Leverage.
We see in the parable of the talents, those that invested, used the talents, received more. Those that held it, was scared to invest, was scared to do anything because of what the master might do if they lost money. We see reward for how you leverage what you have, especially when it comes to the wealthy. I mean, throughout the prophets, you see the rich being condemned because they had more money than the others because they have cheated and robbed and defrauded those that are poor and took advantage of the position to gain more wealth. And so in this period of time in Middle Eastern thought, you have the idea of limited good. So you have
kind of a scarcity mindset.
Yeah,
like if I have, then you don't.
Yes. If I have more than a fair share, then I've taken your share.
So now we're at fair and need and enough again. So I don't know how we define these words, but go ahead.
But the quote, if I have two coats, then I'm a thief because I stole one of them. Would you argue that's not where we are today? Because I would say, if anything, we are actually a more extreme version of that right now. Like when you think about, well, I'm just thinking about my friends in Uganda that live off less than $1 a day. And like when you tell them certain things, like when you tell them the idea that like in our kitchens, we have a water faucet where you twist the knob and it comes directly into our home. We take that for granted. For them, that's like magic. And so like, I think we live in a world where Christians just sort of take wealth, especially in our country, as a given and something that it's good to strive for.
So would you want
I'm pushing back on
would
that.
Would you want to export our view of wealth and money to other nations then?
No. But my point is that we have such an abundance that if we turn a blind eye to those that literally are not sure where their next meal is coming from, they don't have medical supplies, they're not going to school. I think that the New Testament's going to speak directly to us.
I'm reminded of Jesus says, don't let the left hand know what the right hand is doing. And so to me, that echoes or speaks of when I have wealth, when I'm doing things for the kingdom, am I doing it for the acclaim of man or am I doing it for the acclaim of God? And these stewards are given, 20 talents is the equivalent of how many wages in a year. That's an extreme amount of wealth with which he was given stewardship over. So it's not the wealth. I don't think it's the wealth. If Claiborne wants to make a vow of poverty and hey, look at me, everybody. He's already gotten his reward as far as the gospel is concerned.
Right.
Okay. And in terms of Uganda and the United States, I heard this interesting idea that we as people were really not meant to have global awareness all the time. We live in communities. We live in small areas, small footprints. So do I really need to go know what's going on in Uganda here and there? Not that I'm ignoring, but I've got enough troubles here to take care of. There are people here who are in need.
I think I hear you. I personally would push back on that, because globalization and just the fact that we live in a world that's connected by the internet, that we can be in Africa in 12 hours, taking a flight, has shrunk the world. And when you look at the church in Acts, when they heard that another church that wasn't close to them was in need financially, they pulled their resources to give for a church that wasn't right there in their area. Granted, it's closer than we are today, but I would say it's probably the equivalent.
So it was close enough to hear about. Okay, so there is that. But on the other hand, do we know who lives across the street from us, or next to them, or next to us? Do we know what's going on in their lives? Do we know their names? If we're going to be world changers, let's start where we're at.
That's fair. That's fair. I just think that can become an excuse to say, until I know the people in my area, I therefore can't help a person across the world.
We can say the rake is in the yard. Whatever excuse is useful. I mean, the rake is in the yard. I can't do it. Okay. Because an excuse is an excuse. It has served no real purpose.
So the question is, not to say, are you ready to segue?
Yeah.
The segue is for this parable we're doing. Have we already introduced the parable yet?
Yes.
The Shrewd Manager.
No, we have not.
It was the very first thing I said.
Okay, the Shrewd Manager. So we are doing Shrewd Manager today. That's right. We talked about the Lost series.
Yeah.
So the question is this what the parable is about? Is this about the accumulation of money, or is this how we get money? Is this how we use money? Or go ahead, why?
No.
Oh, you're supposed to say yes.
Oh,
Yes, to all those things.
yes.
Let's dig in and find out, because this is definitely one of those, I think, one of the trickier parables,
I love this parable.
because the hero is an unlikely person, I think.
Now he said to the disciples, there was a rich man who received an accusation that his manager was squandering his possessions. So he called the manager in and asked, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can no longer be my manager. Then the manager said to himself, what will I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I'm removed from management, people will welcome me into their homes. So he summoned each one of his master's debtors. How much do you owe my master? He asked the first one. 100 measures of olive oil, he said. Well, take your invoice, he told him. Sit down quickly and write 50. Next, he asked another, how much do you owe? 100 measures of wheat, he said. Well, take your invoice, he told him, and write. The master praised the unrighteous manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd than the children of light in dealing with their own people. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of worldly wealth, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. Whoever is faithful in very little is also faithful in much. And whoever is unrighteous in very little is also unrighteous in much. So if you have been faithful with worldly wealth, who will entrust you with what is genuine? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you what is your own? No servant can serve two masters, since either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money.
I like that dramatic finish.
Do you like that?
That was so good.
I wanted to use mammon.
Mammon.
God,
Mammon.
mammon. Is that what ESV uses?
What
Mammon?
translation was that? Was that the original Message version?
It's CSB.
CSB. All right. Let's ask the most obvious question.
What's the obvious
first.
question, Tim?
Why is a dishonest manager the hero of this story? What are we to take of that?
Or why would Jesus or the writers of, or Luke, the writer of this gospel, put this parable following the
Lost series.
Lost series.
Sons,
The
right?
Lost series.
What's
Why?
the connection?
You've got a question. Hey, Riley, when he asks a question, he always has a presupposed answer.
The rhetorical questions kill me. From all of you, actually.
Wally, I don't know. What do you think?
I think the connection is found in verse number
Eight.
1.
Dang it.
Oh.
1.
Verse 1.
What's similar to this parable that connects it to the last parable? He's doing what
Wandering
with
the possessions.
squandering the possessions, right? The younger boy squandered the property of the daddy, and the daddy's response to his son, and now we have almost, sort of a different reaction from this master because of what this servant has done, or this manager has done with his possessions.
Well, do you think?
Well,
Go ahead.
my question is, whose possessions are they? Are they the servant's possessions, or are they like the owner's
The
possessions?
rich man.
The owners.
It's
Yeah.
the rich
It's
man.
the managers, right? The manager, he doesn't own anything. He just manages what his owner has, right?
Correct.
So-
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So, since you're talking about context of the Lost series before, the audience for the Lost parables, it was the Pharisees.
It was a mixture, right?
Yeah, but I think it was primarily, well, yeah, it was. There was a message kind of for each one, but I think it was primarily to the Pharisees. Now, in this parable,
Who's he talking to? Yeah.
Disciples.
disciples,
That's
but
verse 1, Wally.
it's it reminded me of like if you've ever had a conversation in front of someone and you knew that someone needed to hear the conversation. That's what this feels like, because he turns to the disciples and is telling them this parable. But as we find out, the Pharisees are right there listening to everything. So I almost wonder if, similar to the Lost series, it's Jesus is saying this to the disciples, but he's like, hey guys, are you listening to this? This has something for you too.
So what's your point about the squandering?
I think because we don't have this parable in any other synoptics. So I think Luke.
Can you say synoptics to explain someone what the synoptic?
Synoptic are the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are similar in how they're formed and their structure and everything, where John is a totally different thing. The synoptics is just a telling of chronological events that happened in Jesus. I just think it's interesting how Luke saw this parable to fit following this parable of the lost son. I just find
With
it
the main point that the Pharisees would have been listening to this series on the Lost and be confronted with this idea of who's included in the kingdom. And now this parable comes and like, what's the message to be taken from this one?
What does a kingdom person do with the resources that he has?
He doesn't squander them.
Well, we'll see.
Well, but I mean, and not to chase this little rabbit, but
Too late.
well, I know, but the young son, we thought was the tax collectors, right? Or did we think
Yes,
those were the Pharisees?
yes. That's-
And so the
that's
tax
equivalent.
collectors were the squanderers. Do we think the manager is not the Pharisees here?
That's
Oh, I suggest that the Pharisees are the managers here. I'm sorry.
Jonathan. I feel like you have all the answers.
I've already done a sermon on
I
it.
was
You've done the
the
sermon on it.
expert on this one. I don't know necessarily that there's a correlation between the manager and the Pharisees.
Oh, now, come on.
I
We just said that he's talking through somebody so
see.
somebody else is hearing it.
Maybe. I mean, if you look at what Jesus is saying to what the manager is, the owner is saying to the manager, it is what Jesus is saying to his disciples as we look at the possible ramifications and applications of this parable.
But they haven't managed anything improperly yet. We know the Pharisees have. And so he's just come off talking about the older son, literally just finished talking about the older son, and said, I'm still going to have mercy on you too. And by the way, in that, I've given you possessions. I've given you things to manage, just like I did Adam and Eve in Genesis 2. And you just messed it up and you just didn't do it right. So now I'm going to strip away from you all of that. And now I'm going to make the kingdom on equal ground. Not that wasn't going to happen in the first place, but his point here is everyone's going to come to the table now, including tax collectors, which is what we just went through. And hey, Pharisees, you had your chance, but I just stripped your management abilities away now. And now what are you going to do?
What?
Are you going to double down on that? No,
I said
Jesus saying, hey, Pharisees, you just had all that down. Are you going to now double down on continuing? Are you now going to use what I still have given you to bring more people to the understanding of the gospel?
What's their understanding of the gospel? They don't have an understanding of the gospel.
Well, they have the Old Testament there. So
Jesus says, hey, you go overseas to make a prototype, but you make him twice a member of hell.
I got that. And
So-
that's a little Calvinistic that they didn't have a choice in coming over, but Nicodemus did.
But the problem is,
Supposedly.
the context is that he's speaking to believers and the disciples here.
I disagree.
Well, I'm just going by what the text said.
No.
He says he also said to the disciples.
Uh-huh.
It doesn't say that. I mean, it could be. I mean, we could speculate there's still tax collectors, and that we could speculate there's scribes and Pharisees.
Well, we don't have to
but-
speculate because that's also in the text. Because the Pharisees sneered at the end.
Yeah. And also in chapter 15, we all said, yeah, he's talking to the Pharisees and scribes, but also the disciples were around listening, because then it wouldn't have been any impact if he was telling them, the disciples in 16 about the Shrewd Manager, if they didn't understand what he was saying in the law series. So I think he's talking to all of them. Now, it is important who Luke says he's actually talking directly to.
Yes.
I think that's the primary audience.
Yes.
That's
It's
right.
the disciples.
But they're all hearing it.
The application is for the disciples, but they're all hearing it. But the application is strictly for the
Don't be
disciples.
like those guys,
is the
or be like those guys. I
is
should
the
say.
main point then the shrewdness of this dishonest manager? That's I've heard that before, even among church planters in the Northeast when I was in New York, New Jersey. Some of the most effective church planters they would call themselves shrewd, and they would use passages like this to say, we're called to be shrewd. Some of them were doing things that were like really gray ethically in the name of, I'm just being shrewd for the gospel. Is that what we can take from this?
No.
Well, can you, for someone who's really sleep deprived because finals are coming up and I've been working 24 hours straight for a while,
Sure.
can you explain to me how exactly the manager was shrewd? Because I'm reading it, but my brain isn't processing it.
Good question.
Oh, he answers it. Jesus gives us the answer.
Tell us, Dane. Tell us, Jonathan.
No, you said Daniel, so Daniel has to tell us.
Please.
No, he's using money to gain friends for his own benefit in the future. It's very simple. That's what he says.
How is he using the money? To
What's
be
happening
dishonest?
in the story?
He
'Cause
was
I'm not
just
getting it.
he was just fired by the manager
Okay.
for not being on the up and up with his
By the
finances.
rich man.
Yes.
He's the manager. So
But he goes out immediately, because an hour from now, the whole community is going to know that he's fired. But until then, he has this idea of like, hey, I'm still working for this guy. And then he goes to the debtors and says, okay, you owe less and you owe less. And they just assumed he still worked for this rich man, which he did not.
Or maybe he's on a 2-week notice. Who knows?
Who knows? Maybe he's on a 2-week notice. So you can
I don't think
imagine,
that's a requirement back.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's a pretty big risk because now he goes back to his boss and says, hey, here's what I did. And
but what did he do?
He
settled the accounts.
No, he made
did.
No, he
he
made
just-
friends so that he would be protected when he would leave.
Self-serving, right? He's acting in a self-serving manner.
Sure he is, with
But
the
the-
possessions that weren't his.
But the doing was settling his accounts. He settled the accounts at pennies on the dollar, as it were.
Yeah.
The rich man had those debts. There's no debt. He did it at a loss.
Yeah, which is not a very good thing.
you were asking what was shrewd about it. I think at least part of it was, put yourself in the boss's shoes. All of a sudden you've been told, oh, boss, by the way, you just settled a lot of debts at an extreme discount. The community is going to be like, hey, man,
Sign me up.
this is a great guy. Like, what's he going to do now? And be like, just kidding. I actually need the rest of the money. No, his reputation's been built up by the deceit. And so it's shrewd because now this guy, the manager or the boss really can't do anything at this point. That ship has sailed.
So, Raleigh, to answer your question, the shrewdness here is that he was able to be wise in the situation, to have power in his hands, and he used that power for his own benefit in making friends so that when he would be unemployed by the rich man, he would have a job without having to dig a ditch or beg. So now he would have friends and allies by the use of someone else's loss so that he then could be taken care of.
Is that being dishonest in his position as a manager?
Yes. That's why it's called dishonest manager.
But why then would the rich man commend him for what he did?
Okay. So this is where it gets weird in it.
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
There's some interpretation that says that in this time frame, the manager could collect a commission on top of what he is doing.
Tax collectors.
So he wrote it up.
He's just taking away his commission or surcharge I'm not saying that is what's happening here,
Yeah.
but some people would use this to ameliorate Jesus in commending, or at least in the parable, the owner commending the manager, because now the manager's taking the loss for himself, that he could have gained the money, that he says, no, I'm going to take a loss on my end. The owner's still going to get his share, and I'm going to be all right.
I don't know. That's too much extrapolation. Has anybody ever seen the best show ever by Donald J. Trump called The Apprentice?
Unfortunately,
You're fired.
Oh, it's
Can't
the
say I
best
have.
show.
Yeah.
It's the best show. I have introduced my kids to this recently. They just put it back up after years. So
I wonder why.
Can you see him at the table when someone has done something a little shrewd that maybe undercut somebody else, maybe even Trump himself, but it really was kind of cool?
Right. And
Hey,
out in a good way.
He's like, dude, or lady, that was really good. You really did a good job there. Y'all need to be watching what they just did, because that is what this is all about.
He showed finally some gumption, some like proactivity,
Some
right?
initiative, but
Yep.
he saw through it, used what he had wisely in a pure righteous movement, but he used what he had wisely, and he did it for his own benefit, and out of that, he gets something
Friends is what you
But-
said.
in low places.
Thank you, Garth.
Can I sing it?
But Trump
Please do.
wasn't affected, right? Now, if he had a guy working for him that, if we extrapolate what the reduction of the bills were, some estimate that's 500 denarii, or 500 days' wages, or
Yeah,
20
we got
months and days.
It's a lot of
It's a
money.
lot of money.
More
that-
than $2.
It's a lot of money that this guy's
Maybe he had him in the wrong job.
Well, see, but I think the parallel that Jesus makes then, because he's saying, look, you'll be faithful in the little, you'll be faithful in much. If you're dishonest in little, you'll be dishonest in much. And he's equating these two in money. I need to trust you with true riches, the true riches of what my kingdom
Are the things that
has.
last, the things
are
that
the
are
things that are
eternal.
important.
Hey.
So I can see your point. Pharisees, you've been messing up with the true riches.
The Old Testament is truth, but you're using it in a very untruthful way. You've been using it for your own benefit to lift yourself up. You haven't used the genuineness of what the gospel, what the truth of the Old Testament was about. And when you didn't, I'm stripping that away from you now. So, Raleigh, what I think the commendation here for using unrighteous wealth in a way benefiting him, a friendship with others so that he would be taken care of, I think that is what he's commending him for. Not that he act unrighteously,
Of course.
but that he used the situation and he saw through the situation. And the situation was, I have something that I can use to benefit me in the community after this.
So to Wally's point, he said the primary audience are the disciples.
Yeah.
Is that then the main point that Jesus is saying, hey, disciples, like friendship over money, or use money in anything that is like temporal for actual relationships? Is that what he's telling the disciples? If not, what is he trying to get the disciples to
Well, he
what-
says it.
change?
Go ahead,
Well,
Wally.
our boy Craig L. Blomberg
Blomberg's back.
Blomberg News.
Oh,
Blomberg.
Blomberg.
would see the three scenes here, right? So you have the first scene with the manager and the owner, then you have the manager with the debtors, and then you have the manager with the owner again. And he would see this parable having three main points. Number one, there's coming an account with what you've done with the master's resources.
Okay.
You're going to have to give an account what you've done with your owner's resources. Number two, he says, so you need to be preparing for that account. You need to be wise in how you use and what you and how you go about it to be prepared to give an account for what you've done, as we see in the master's commendation and Jesus' response in 10 to 13. Those who live a life that is faithful to what God has done will be rewarded with eternal life.
Yeah, but what is that? I mean, we're throwing out word. It says 11. So if you have not been faithful with worldly wealth, that's mammon. And actually, I think some translators say unrighteous riches.
And that comes that's a common phrase that when they found the Qumran scrolls,
yeah.
when they talk about mammon and money, that's how they refer
So
to it.
what is mammon?
Yes, we want to talk about the MN. MN is very important here. But who will trust you with what is genuine? And he goes on to say, if you haven't been faithful with what belongs to someone else, who will give you what is your own? I think what my point is, what is the mammon here, as what we're going to talk about, I guess, next. What is mammon, and why was he so clever and shrewd to use it, and what was the benefit? What was he trying to say, right? That's where we're headed with this. That's kind of
Yeah.
what Raleigh's question was.
Absolutely.
So what is the worldly wealth here? What is the mammon?
especially for a believer, for a disciple.
In this parable here,
Well, that's what we're talking about.
it's money. How you do with the
So
resources.
we can just substitute mammon for money.
I think in this case you can.
Money resources, I think, is really.
Well, in this one it was accounts, so that's the literal interpretation should be he had accounts, which was money,
Yeah.
or numbers on a page.
Yeah.
But we would say that's not always just money.
Right, because mammon actually is more than money. And you're right that it can be interpreted here, but isn't mammon also a god or a force,
Correct.
a spiritual force?
And I forgot it was Akkadian or Sumerian or whatever, but this in Hebrew, this is the MN root of which we get pistoi. Is that how you say it? Pistoi, faith?
I think so.
Yeah, all those words in the Hebrew as they translate over are all coming from the same MN, which is something you trust in. These are all trust language words of, do you trust in wealth? Do you trust in God? Do you trust in your abilities? So the question is, if he used unrighteous wealth shrewdly and he gets commended, what does that mean for us? What is the worldly wealth for us? What is the unrighteous riches for us? How are we supposed to use that? What's the shrewdness that we're supposed to use for? And what's the goal we're trying to get to with that?
Yeah. Because he says the sons of this world,
Sons of this age.
sons of this age, sons of this world, dealing with their own generation. So it's an argument from the lesser to the greater, right? So we're seeing how you deal with money. If you're shrewd with how you're using money to gain influence with others, then how much more should you be using the resources that God's provided?
But what is
for us?
that? It's money, though. It is going
Money,
to be
yes.
position, social class, how pretty or how handsome you are.
Absolutely.
It could be anything, your political status. But it is, and like you said, in this case, it is money. If you're not going to use unrighteous wealth to gain friends, then what are you using it for?
If you're not using that as leverage to be able to influence the lives of others, why am I giving it?
Yeah, that leverage is where I love this word. We talked about leverage a lot yesterday.
Oh, see, there you go.
No, we did.
Conversation.
No. But you said leverage to benefit other people. But what does that mean? Does that mean sending money to Uganda?
That's the question.
Leverage is a multiplier.
Yes.
It's a multiplier force. Depending on where you put that fulcrum,
Correct.
it allows you to multiply the strength that you have to move.
Should see me and Wally on a seesaw.
But is that what Jesus is saying to the disciples? In communication, one of the things they say, the number one rule, know your audience. These disciples are not well off. Maybe Matthew has some money, but they're pretty poor. Why is Jesus' main point to them? Hey, be careful. Like,
Because he's actually talking to the Pharisees. That's why I say.
Why?
Why does he
See what
talk
you did
about
there.
money more than twice as much as he talks about any other topic?
I don't know.
This is why I would say because money is not neutral. I think mammon, that word is important. It's a force, a spiritual force. We can definitely see how folks might say Shane Claiborne has gone too far. But at the same time, we have to be careful when we just look at money as neutral. I don't think it's neutral. There is a force to it that draws us towards all the negative ways it can be used as opposed to the positive.
So then, how does churches misuse the money or mammon that we have been given by God? Do we fail to influence friends, or are we influencing people in the wrong ways, in the wrong direction?
There's this rhetorical question again.
I'm just throwing it out.
Yeah, I think so. And then this gets real weird. Then it's like, do we become Claibornes out there and just get rid of everything? But who are we going to give it to? We're going to give it to those that don't need. Well, then they'll be not need anymore, but then we'll be in need and they're going to give it back. And, where does this go with the economic structure that we live in America? Laissez-faire, capitalism. What do you do with all that? I don't know that we have to destructure the economic American system here, but I do think that just very, very singularly, if I have something of value, something that may or may not be neutral, which we haven't pushed back or agreed with him on that yet, is what are we doing with those things? If it's a friendship over here that you can help somebody over there, but you may burn something that you could have actually gotten, but you're using it for somebody else. Is it money? Is it a house? Is it a car? Whatever it is, I think what God's saying to me through this, because that's who he was writing to, was me, that was a joke, is what do I have in my hands that I can create a community for the eternal tabernacle, the tabernacle that has never had a beginning or end? What can I do to gain friends for the community, not necessarily to help them, Because sometimes you give them money, it doesn't help them. It makes them worse.
Right.
Can I do so
Relationally.
so you're creating relationships here. That's what you're doing with money.
And that is very different, right, than writing a check and sending it like to Uganda or somewhere else.
Go do it to
To
go
your
to Daniel's.
point, relationships.
That's the low hanging fruit. And I think to your point, it's not neutral. If you ask a guy in the street, well, if you won the lottery, what would you do?
Never work again is what they usually say.
Those answers reveal their heart. It reveals what's important to them. It reveals what they're pursuing. Men go out and work to pursue the things they desire. And I think Jesus is saying here, there's true riches. And I want you to pursue those because you can't pursue the empty promise of mammon. It's temporal and it's not the true riches.
But I will say that verse 10, 11, to go to your point. Okay. So if you have not been faithful with worldly wealth that we just found out before is going to fail us. That's in 9. So we're given unrighteous wealth, position or power or status. We're given unrighteous stuff. God's given that to us. We're supposed to use that not for its own possession or accumulation because it's going to fail us. Because that's what 9 says. We are to use that so that he will trust us eventually, trust us with something that is genuine, something that's not counterfeit or fake. What we think money is not what it is. What we see as genuine in verse 11, when we're given that, then what it supposedly is and what it looks like is actually what it is. And I think the idea for me is we're going to have the abilities and opportunities to have unrighteous wealth or value, and that we're going to have to use that in the correct way. If we don't, we're going to miss out on the genuineness of what God's really got for us on the other side.
So-
Which is also framed in the goats and the sheep, right? Whatever you did to the least of these, you did for me, which would be an extension of using this unrighteous wealth for the care of others.
Purpose of good.
So then, am I going too far then to sort of
Yes, because you asked a question.
Yes.
that
Yes.
if we don't use money, unrighteous money in righteous ways, then we will not be given the stewardship of the more weighty spiritual eternal things?
So as long as you're not going to the justification stage, I'm not saying he's going to strip anything.
I'm not
I know
going
you're
there.
not going to
I'm
believe
not-
that.
I'm
Believe
not-
me, I got that.
I'm not going there. I'm just saying.
Calvinist Wally, I know you don't believe that, but I just want to make sure a podcast listener doesn't think that if you're not using your wealth right, you could lose your justification
No,
of
I
value. But no, I think absolutely right. I wish I could tell the watermelon joke. Gosh.
Can you not go for it?
Oh, I can't very good at it. Two guys go to Georgia. They buy a truckload of watermelons. They buy $1 a watermelon. They come back to their hometown. They're going to make some money. And so they sell watermelons 2 for $2. Okay. And they sell out the whole watermelon. The whole truck's gone. And at the end, they said, "Hey, how'd we do?" He's like, "Well, we didn't make any money." He's like, "Really?" He's like, "Yeah. Well, what do you think we should do about it?" I think we need to buy a bigger truck. So the concept here is the insanity of continuing to use riches for our own benefit. You're going to keep banging your head against a wall, and there's nothing ever genuine going to come out of that. I think what God is saying is, I have given you stuff that's temporal and unrighteous. Let it fly out of your hands, not to go to Claiborne's, but let it fly out of your hands to help the community and friends around you so that I will entrust with you something that will be genuine.
So then we could say that happens on an individual level. Will that happen
A community
on a macro
yes,
level when it comes to
sure.
churches?
The communities do it. That when the church of whatever sent to the church of whatever, Jerusalem or whatever, and they needed. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's individual. I think it's community. I think he's saying, I'm giving you valuable stuff in the world's eyes for you to get valuable stuff in the spiritual eyes, which is relationships and community and people. It's not the stuff that you accumulate. And that's not that, it's kind of the old adage. It's not like it's.
And I think it's whatever you give fuel to, right? If you begin to be generous and at first it's difficult, you do that and you're now putting your trust not in money, you're putting your trust in God. You get better at it and you lean into that. The opposite is also true. If you're using unrighteous wealth for just your personal gain, that force kicks in and all of a sudden it becomes all about you. That's why I think if you look at verses 10 through 12, the word trust is over and over again because it's about where you're going to put your trust. Are you putting your trust in the things of this world or in the things that are eternal?
That's right. And I will say the hate word there, I think it's not a hate as in hate and love. I do think hate here is a priority.
Love
We're-
less.
That's very good. That's one of the interpretations of hate is you just love it less. It doesn't mean you can't have money to go to what Claiborne's saying. But if you love it more than you love the community and the people around you, then you're not doing it right. You should be hating it.
Good. And that's the main point the disciples should have taken from this, correct? Is that what
The
I heard?
Pharisees through the disciples.
The Pharisees
Yeah,
that were listening.
via the eavesdropping.
That's right.
We didn't read this far, but verse 14, the Pharisees, and I love this, who loved money, heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. And he said to them, you are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of others, but God knows your hearts. What people value highly is detestable in God's sight. That's pretty extreme. But I think
Because of their status and because of their money and because of what the control they had power over all the other Jewish minions. He's talking to Jewish minions and the disciples, let's be honest. And he's saying, this is where you need to Don't be like them.
So I think it's a jarring criticism and question to the American church is to the American church, are you wealthy? You are absolutely wealthy. What are you going to do with that? Are you going to leverage it for the things of this earth? Or are you going to leverage it for the kingdom of God? I hope this conversation has been helpful. This is a very rich and layered parable.
I like how you did that, Rich.
No
And,
pun intended.
Yeah, dig into this, discuss it, argue with others about it. And we'll see you next week.